Hello and welcome everyone to today's Association for Manufacturing Excellence webinar titled Value Stream Mapping for Office and Service. I'm Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenter is Drew Locker, the Managing Director of Change Management Associates. Drew is a 4-time author and 2-time Shingo Prize recipient, including the best-selling Lean book, The Complete Lean Enterprise Value Stream Mapping for Office and Service. It is the go-to reference on the subject. Drew has been applying enterprise excellence concepts to office and service environments for over 25 years, including financial institutions, hospitality, healthcare, engineering, and the back office of manufacturers. He is an instructor for the University of Michigan's Lean Leadership and CATA programs, as well as a faculty member of the Lean Enterprise Institute and the Theta Care Center for Healthcare Value. Drew is a highly rated speaker at the annual AME conference. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We'll review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. Drew has also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now, I am pleased to introduce Drew Locker, who will present Value Stream Mapping for Office and Service. Take it away, Drew.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you all for joining us today on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, value stream mapping. So, don't have a lot of time to go over this or think about it, just 50 minutes or so with some Q&A at the end. So let's get started. What I'd like to cover during the program is, just talk about, how do we apply this very powerful assessment tool to office and service environments. I'm sure a lot of people in the call maybe applied it in manufacturing. So, when I kind of speak on this subject, it tends to have we're dealing with a very diverse group of experiences. So I'll do the best I can. But if there's any things that, specific questions that please make sure that Jerry gets those and we'll cover those at the end. It's not advancing, Jerry. Oh, there it goes. All right, so first let's define what a value stream is. Just pulled this from Jim Womack and Dan Jones, Lean Thinking, which is, I would suggest required reading if you're going to use lean terminology. Wherever there's a product or a service for a customer, there's a value stream. The challenge lies in seeing it. And in the Lean Thinking book, the authors define 3 primary value streams. One is the physical transformation of raw materials to a product that would take you through a manufacturing operation. Another is problem solving. The market has a problem, you design a solution, so that would get into engineering and design kind of activities. And then there's everything else, kind of information management. And the trick here is that, if you look at this list at the bottom of the slide here, quoting, order processing, purchasing, hiring, shipping, these are all individual processes, and what we have to start recognizing, and that's the challenge, is that a lot of these processes are strongly interrelated. So it's not, let's go map order processing. It's probably more the value stream is a series of strongly related processes that make up the value stream, which would include order processing, shipping, invoicing, and accounts receivable. So if an organization says, hey, we want you to help us map out purchasing, like, well, we're not just going to do purchasing. It's got to be purchasing, maybe, start even sooner, inventory management, where we would, define the need to buy something, and then the purchasing activity, and then the receiving activity, and the accounts payable. So it's these strongly interrelated processes that make up an overall value stream, and that is really what you want to map. So this is a conversation that we have before we start mapping anything, just to clearly define what the scope and the boundaries are of the mapping and really redesign effort. a purpose of value stream mapping, I'm going to use some Toyota terminology, which I hope is okay for folks. There's really two types of improvements. There's incremental or process level type improvement, and Toyota calls that Kaizen. They also have a term for radical or system level improvement, and I believe it's pronounced Kaikuku. So that's really what we're after with value stream mapping is the latter, the radical system level improvement. We're looking to apply this methodology of improvement to get us breakthrough, significant improvement, really changing fundamentally the way work flows. If we were just doing incremental process level improvement, there are other methodologies that we could use. We could use, A3s perhaps. Now, all these methodologies, and value stream mapping being one of them, are all based on PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. They're just variations of these things. However, each of those methodologies has different social implications. And value stream mapping is a tremendous social tool, which we'll get into later. But, we're going to look at systems, a series of interrelated processes that make up the value stream, the system, and that typically will cut across multiple departments, multiple functions. And therefore, what a great methodology, great tool to help develop collaboration between those departments and functions that maybe haven't worked as well together as they should. So in organizations, we're talking about what's the right approach. If they start talking about, we need to get these different departments and functions on the same page, I'm thinking value stream mapping because it is a very, very powerful tool for developing that collaboration. Another purpose of value stream mapping is to visualize these systems, often complex systems, that once again are cutting across multiple departments and functions. And for those of you who are familiar with Stephen Spear, part of the Lean community and some of his colleagues, they coined a term called the DNA of Lean, and they define that as activities, pathways, and linkages. And a value stream map clearly shows all three of those, and again, why it's a very powerful tool. It helps us identify problems from a system perspective, and that also then can help us focus our improvement efforts to benefit the overall system. Now, like any tool, you can misuse it, and we don't want to do that because that tends to upset people, and then they don't want to do these things. So how would you misuse it? Well, I had a call from a person just a few weeks ago, and he was like, we need to map out every department. I was like, well, you don't use value stream mapping to map out departments. You're mapping out the information flows that a department, might be processing, or at least a portion of it. And, here in the discussion, the person was conveying a lot of frustration with value stream mapping as a methodology. And make a long story short, they were misusing the tool. We're mapping out the information or the service processes that cut across functions or departments. So if an organization says we want to value stream map our customer service department, I was like, you can't do that. What information processes are your customer service people involved in? Which of those do you want to map? And we can map that out. And oh, by the way, we're going to have to go get others involved outside the customer service department. So hopefully that makes sense for you, because if we misuse the tool, it just upsets people, and then they don't have a positive experience with it, and therefore they don't want to do this. I often talk about the key here is we want value stream improvement, not process improvement. We're trying to improve the overall system with value stream mapping. Now, what this means is that the value stream is a series of very interrelated processes that are cutting across multiple departments. In this example, maybe sales, and customer service, and engineering, and purchasing, and so on. We want to see the activities, the processes. We want to see the linkages, the pathways between these functions and departments. And we want to see the linkages or lack of linkages between these processes and these functions and departments. So again, a great tool to see all that. But when we get into really what is our objective here is we want to improve the performance of the overall system or value stream. And that might require functions and departments at the process level to do some things differently. Most people, when you talk about doing things differently, there's going to be some resistance to that. But we have to remind people that we might ask customer service to do something differently, or we might ask sales to do something differently, because that's what's right for the overall whole. I often have to remind people, organizations, and certainly the mapping teams, when they start hunkering down in their functional silos, that they have to put the big hat on. They got to look at this as a system, as a value stream. And we may ask people to do things differently that might even constitute more work for a particular area, but it's going to help improve and help everyone in the long run. So we got to kind of put the big hat on. So we're after value stream improvement. We don't want to sub-optimize. For any of you that read, the goal from Ellie Goldrat, been around since 1984, that book, that's one of the teaching points that Ellie always made was, don't sub-optimize. I could have the best customer service department and the best sales department, the best engineering department the world has ever seen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that value stream is better performing because of the lack of linkages between the steps. So put the big hat on. That's what we're after. We're after system improvement, and hopefully, significant improvement, radical improvement. The history of this, goes back to, in a formal sense, Learning to See from Mike Rother and John Shook, came out in 1997, which taught us how to map, in manufacturing. And people tried to take that reference and apply it to office and service and have struggled a bit. Some of us have been mapping these processes for decades now. We call them level 0 maps, my co-author and I, back in the early 90s. So where's the source of the struggle? Well, the office and service is a little bit different. And we need to recognize that, acknowledge that. First, the value streams are not well defined, and it's a struggle just getting the process boxes in place. Experienced that this week. Also, for those of you who have mapped before, we put date on the map. It'll help us create eyes for flow and eyes for waste. That's an expression we're going to use probably several times this afternoon. And very often we have to gather that data for the first time. So that makes it a little difficult. There's not an abundance of data in a lot of office and service processes. Another challenge is that the level of multitasking that's going on in office and service functions tends to be quite high, higher than in manufacturing usually. So again, you don't map a function, you map the information flows or the services that function is providing or delivering, and that's what you got to focus on. So I'll stick with the customer service example. What are the things that they're really doing? Well, they're processing orders, okay? Let's map that and can take that to its full conclusion of shipping and invoicing and collecting the money. So we would do maybe an order to cash value stream. But there's other things that customer service person does. Well, what else do they do? Well, problem solve. What does that mean? Well, they get phone calls, people are asking for the status of their order, things like that. And so that's a different activity the customer service does, and that may or may not, warrant a separate value stream map. I don't know, but it could. So that the multitasking nature that a lot of people do in office and service makes this a little more complicated. But we just have to be clear on what process, what value stream are we really trying to map. In some cases, not always, there's not that line of sight with the customer, the service provider and the customer. Some businesses, it's very clear. Hospitality, for example. But in back office environments, in manufacturers, sometimes you don't have that line of sight. So it's more difficult to understand the customer and therefore what the customer sees as value. This also makes it a little difficult. Waste is not as visible in office and service these days, particularly because the work tends to be in electronic format very often. It's more difficult to see. The old days, when we were doing paper and all, was much more visible in a lot of ways. So that's another challenge. But all these differences really scream for the need to do a value stream map, because it's going to make the work very visible. It's going to make sense out of it. We're going to be clear on what the customer needs are as part of this process. So a lot of groups, this week was no different. The group I'm working with this week, they struggled. And I said it's going to be a lot easier when you map this process the second time. Because when we're doing continuous improvement, we should be mapping and remapping these processes and trying to drive continuous improvement over time, maybe years. And, they looked at me and they say, well, you're going to start with a documented state. You're going to start with data systems already in place. So it's going to make the mapping exercise a lot easier than it was the first time, where they were really, really, getting frustrated. But through frustration comes learning, and that's what it's all about. Now, we don't wake up in the morning and say, let's go map, and I've seen people use this tool and go crazy with it. We really want to map to meet business objectives. So when I speak to organizations about mapping and maybe they have an idea of what they want to map, I ask why. How is redesigning this key business process or system, how is this going to help you meet your strategic objectives and the direction you established for the business? And if the answer is it doesn't, then maybe we should map something else. And I would say, not so bad these days, but I would say probably a good 25% of the time what the organization thought they wanted to map, we don't map. We end up mapping something else when we have this conversation. What is your business objectives? Once you define what value stream we want to map, then we can talk about the specific, performance goals, the target that we want that value stream to be able to meet, and those become the key design parameters for the future state. So this is an important conversation to have before you start mapping anything. Within that business process or value stream, we may, talk a little further and find out, not all things are the same, not all work is the same. So in this simplified example, maybe this is like an order to cash type of value stream, and we find out, well, the process changes based on what the customer orders. And I'll say, well, what does that mean? They say, well, we have standard orders that we just enter the order, and we create some documentation, and we're off and running. There'll be a lot more steps on the right-hand side of this, but we'll just keep it simple for our conversation today. And they'll say, well, other orders, other products are custom. They require some engineering or design activity, and we have to provide a quote to the customer. And hopefully later we get the order that we can enter and then create some documentation and go fulfill that order. And, it's important to understand these, what we call service or product families, because this helps us understand what is it we really want to map. In this example, you could have to maybe do two maps. You might map out the standard process, standard product process. You might separately do the custom process, because the processing steps are quite different. It might be that, now, Drew, we could do the custom, and really when we get to enter order and create documents, what we learn from that can apply to standard, so maybe one map fits both of these. The key is to have this conversation ahead of time so we're real clear what are we mapping. And we're not spinning our wheels trying to figure out where do we start, where do we end, who should be on the team even, that kind of thing. And you can have this same conversation with really anything. You can do this with the hiring process. Who am I hiring? The CEO, an hourly team member? The processing steps will be very different. Probably the needs of the organization will be very different. And we warrant probably different maps. Purchasing, what am I buying? Am I buying, multi-million-dollar pieces of capital equipment? Am I buying office supplies? Odds are, based on the answer to that, the processing steps will be very different. The needs of the organization probably are very different. And, we've got to decide what is it specifically we want to map. So hopefully that makes sense. This also starts getting people thinking not just what to map, but maybe we've got to reconsider for in the future state how we're organized. Like in this example, maybe I have the same resources doing all this work, and maybe standard product is not flowing as well as it should because the same resources are also trying to do the custom product. So this could, lead to another conversation about, how we're organized and something we might want to consider in the future state design. It's not just about what mapping, it can lead to deeper conversations of how we're organized. The process is pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Drew, would you be able to put the phone a little bit closer to you? I guess there's an issue with sound quality, so if you could,
okay.
They're having a little bit hard time to understand. Is that okay?
Okay, I'll try. I turned it up a little more. I don't know if that's
Great.
Better.
Okay.
The process of value stream mapping is pretty straightforward. You don't wake up in the morning and say, let's go map. There's a preparation activity that goes on, typically 3 to 4 weeks ahead. And we're agreeing on what value stream, what service family within that, or product family within that, the logistics, who we need on the team, maybe even collect data. Because there's not an abundance of data available. in office and services, it would behoove us to gather some of that prior to the event, where manufacturing might be able to go see and collect the data through direct first-hand observation. The process itself is based on a state model for change, which has been around since the 1960s. Current state map, you understand what you're doing today and get a collective understanding of that. Then a future state, picture of where we want to go, and then a plan to get there. And we typically do these as an event, not necessarily in 2 to 4 consecutive days. Sometimes we'll break them up a bit if the logistics allow. And but you're looking at a 2 to 4 day exercise to do the current state, the future state, and a plan to get there. I do want to highlight the terms agreeing. This is that collaboration benefit that I referred to earlier. People come in knowing pieces of the current state, but very few people know the overall whole. So they'll learn from each other. It's a big part of the current state mapping exercise. And the future state, they'll agree on this shared vision of how they think it should be. And that in and of itself will also help with collaboration. So that's the process. Here's a simplified map I use in some training called Cabby's Cable Service. And just using this as an example to point out some of the icons, like the upper here where I'm circling, hopefully you can see that, is an outside resource icon that represents maybe customers or suppliers, a data box underneath that is maybe collects or depicts voice of the customer information. In this case, we've got volume or demand. We've got lead time expectations of the customer, maybe some measure of quality, how we're doing in meeting customer expectations. We've got our process boxes. Nice two maps tend to be a little higher level. So one of the questions we get is, what level of detail do we need? In other words, where do we stop a process box and start the next one? Usually at a handoff between functions, because usually at a handoff between functions, there's the opportunity for a queue. This is our queue icon, the little inbox icon that we use. Queues of significance, I should say. Underneath the process box is a data box that relates to the process box above it. And we've got our big three usually here, PT, process time, lead time, complete and accurate. We point out with complete and accurate, this is a measure of the information quality. I could have complete information that's inaccurate, or I could have missing incomplete information. And we always ask that question of the recipient. So in this case, I would ask the dispatcher in step 2, what is the complete and accurate of the information they're receiving from customer service at the first step. And we do that because you'll get better information. If you ask a person what is the completeness and accuracy of their work that they pass on, most people are going to tell you 100%. So you don't ask the person who's creating it, you ask the recipient. Some other icons, we have the waiting icon. A lot of office work is iterative in nature, so we have the iteration icon, the little arrows going in a circle, that kind of thing. Caddies is I use a lot in my training, and when we do like one-day workshops, I'll hand out the data set to groups. I'll break the participants into several groups, let them start mapping it out on walls and things. And they'll take the same data set, and if I have 3 groups, they might have 3 different variations of the current state map, all of which are fine. So there's no single correct way to depict the current state. The key is just don't overly complicate the map if you don't need to, and don't, on the other end, don't oversimplify it and not learning what you need to learn. A couple of other things to point out. We have our little step function towards the bottom here. Sometimes we can do this, sometimes we can't do this, where the data in Cabby's is quite specific, pretty neat. Where it's very clear what's in queue, lead time-wise, versus what's embedded within a process box. But generally speaking, we want to, we're focusing on the top line lead time, the bottom line is process time. Just keep in mind, sometimes we cannot do this very neat step function, that people do, I've seen in some of the books. And that's okay. That's all right. So we have the data in the data boxes, we can still make the proper assessments and draw the proper conclusions. Also, in the lower right, we have the summary metrics, and I encourage people to consider multiple summary metrics. In this case, we don't just have one expression of lead time, we have two. The customer, in this example of cable service where you're signing up for a cable, a technician to come out to your house and set you up on with cable, or maybe a satellite. Well, the customer cares about the total time from request to install. But the owner of this business cares about the overall lead time, including the back end, billing and all activity. So you can have multiple expressions of lead time, multiple expressions of process time. You got to think about what it is you're trying to learn and what your objectives are, and that'll dictate, what specific metrics you should have in the data boxes and also for the summary. The last thing I'll point out on the slide is the first pass yield. This is a summary metric of the quality performance of the process. And what it does is it takes the quality metrics, in this case the C&A, the complete and accuracy, it takes the decimal equivalents of each of those and multiplies them out. So we would take 1.0 times 0.9 times 0.95 and so on, and we get this number of first pass yield of just under 50%, 49%. It is a clear measure of defect or correction waste. In other words, 51% of the requests for installations require some sort of, or encounter some sort of quality problem. So very often that number is very low in Office and Service Value Stream apps, and therefore is the primary focus of the first future state. So the icons are a language, and when you are just doing this or just starting this, it takes time for people to develop their understanding of this language. So the language is helping us create eyes for flow and eyes for waste. It's helping us understand work, understand the flow of work. So we've got, again, the process boxes. We've got the data boxes that relate to the process box above it. We have our outside resource icon, which could be for customers or suppliers. Our inbox or queue icon, where work is accumulating. We've got people icons or workers. You can use that if you want. The rectangular icon is the information that we're passing off. If I go back, we've got requests for installations. I have bills. We have service request forms, service order forms. These are the forms and things that we're using. Sometimes that information is manual, hard copy. We use the straight arrow line. Sometimes it's truly electronic, where it's just being transmitted within a computer, and we use the lightning bolt line. But just to clarify, fax, for example, comes over in bits and bytes, but someone on the other end has to still type that information in. We do not use this lightning bolt icon. That is still a manual transfer of information, though it's using an electronic media for that. Okay? Some of these other icons are what we would use possibly for a future state. Moving on, some tips for mapping, current state mapping. Back to that question, how much detail should I have? Well, remember we went eyes for flow and eyes for waste, but we don't want to highlight every waste. And that might sound counter to what you think in terms of lean, but think about your business objectives and what are the key wastes that we need to focus on. So keep that in mind. We don't want to highlight every stoppage of flow, just the key ones. Well, what makes it key? Well, how big of a stoppage of flow? How much of an interruption it is? Even in cabbies, I could have, stoppages of minutes, but if you go, think about it, it's really over the context of days. I don't really care about minutes. I care about maybe hours or days or half days. So use it as a guide to help you to determine what the appropriate level of detail should be. All right, because I get maps to look at for people every other night, and sometimes I'll see just too many process boxes, and they can't see the forest for the trees. Another tip for current state mapping is there is some variability in the process. An order is not an order, a quote is not a quote. So ranges are acceptable. We encourage you to put ranges. Too many maps I see have single numbers for the data. I'm like, wow, is everything that consistent? They're like, no. I said, well, why wouldn't you put a range on? Well, the examples in the book are just a single number. I thought that's what we're supposed to do. Like, no. If you have variation in this process, express it as a range. Now be careful. We don't want the outliers, and sometimes that'll come up. And they'll be like, well, when was it, how long did it take? Oh, it took 20 days one time. I was like, wow, when was the last time that happened? Like 5 years ago. That's an outlier. Let's not worry about that. So be careful of the outliers. But ranges for all of the data, process time, lead time, whatever are acceptable. It generates a lot of good conversation and what is the source of that variability. Another tip, map as a team. I've seen people break the map up, and different, 2 or 3 people will map different segments. You're not getting that holistic system view and thinking. You're not getting that collaboration of all going out learning together. You lose a lot of that. So I would suggest not doing that. Or have some, industrial engineer or process engineer or lean guy or gal, going along mapping and then bringing that back, creating the map, and then bring that back to everybody. It's a very social tool, and you got to have the team do this and do it together. Lastly, a tip that I see quite often not happening is show and tell. People are mapping in conference rooms. They're telling each other what they do, and then I'll kind of quiz them, and and I'll get people expressing different understanding of what was just said. And really, what you want to do is show and tell. We actually go see the work being done in the natural work environment where we can. Sometimes we'll do this in the conference room, but we still get access to the tools, the systems. We're beaming them up on a projector so everyone can see them. You got to show and tell. Engages more senses. Everyone has a better understanding of what is being conveyed. So please show and tell. Don't just tell. Don't just be in conference rooms when you're doing these mapping exercises. Moving on to the future state. We don't just willy-nilly do this either. There should have been predetermined business goals and objectives that were established before we started mapping anything. Very specific, measurable goals or targets. And those become the focus of the redesign effort. A brainstorming session where everyone's just throwing ideas up, because you could come up with 100 ideas for improvement in 100 ways that we may have seen. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. What are the key things that we need to really work on? And I've seen this way too often, where the future state, all it is a current state with 100 Post-it notes up of 100 ways, and they make a long list out of these things with names and dates. And I was like, how's that working? And most of the time, it's like, well, we don't get to 3/4 of this. And I'm like, okay, that should be some good learning. And I'll say, but what were your goals and objectives? And they start articulating those, and I'm like, help me understand how all 100 of these address that, affect those goals or objectives. And they can't sometimes, and that is good learning as well. So it's not a waste for. It's that often results in drive-by Kaizen. We want to focus on the key things, and that can only happen if we've established a direction and the specific goals and targets and objectives prior to mapping. Kind of skipped over the second bullet here. It's a thoughtful process of redesigning the current state based on lean concepts. And that thought process is embodied by our future state questions, which we'll go over in a moment. Some other tips on designing the future state. The future state should be achievable in a reasonable time frame. We believe that elements of it should be implementable, that's a word, within 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9. Typically, the whole future state should not go out any further than a year, preferably less, maybe 6 months. We don't want to go too far out because things change. There's too much uncertainty there. And also we want to show people that change doesn't have to drag out for a year or longer. We need to give people relief sooner, and we think 3 months is reasonable. If people, after this effort, this mapping exercise, start seeing improvement, start getting relief within 3 months, I think people will be feeling good about this. Too often, all the ideas for the future state are just way out there, and everyone, it just loses momentum. People get frustrated, and again, they disengage from this. Another thing that I say very often is 70% and keep updating. We're not going to have 100% certainty that whatever we put up in this future state is truly achievable, and that's okay. People have to deal with uncertainty. So I said, do you think you have a 70% chance of implementing that idea in 3 months? And they say, yeah, we go with it. How about if no, how about 3 to 6? Yeah, then we'll go with it. But if they're saying, Drew, we don't have 70% chance of doing that in 2 years, we do not assume that. You know, it might be a great idea and someone else can pursue it, but we don't assume that in our future state design for value, as part of value stream mapping. So I find that the 70% and the 3-month bucket type of guideline helps people, you know, come up with something that's achievable, reasonable, and not too out there, too crazy. So here are the future state questions. And these, to me, is really the meat of value stream mapping. These questions embody lean thinking. You know, what does the customer really need? And I emphasize need versus want. Customer wants everything. This could be an internal customer, it could be an external customer. You know, this week we asked internal customers, what do you want? Oh, they'll tell you, I want, you know, a magic button and things, you know, to do all my work automated for me. Well, what do you really need? And you get a very different conversation. So what do we need? Next question is, what steps create value and what's your waste? Should not, you know, surprise you. We have that question. But as you'll see, we want to be, you know, guarded with that question. We want to be focused. Next question is, how do we flow work with few interruptions? Flow is a key concept of lean, just like value or non-value added is. How will interruptions in the flow be controlled? This gets into the concept of pull, another key concept of lean. Next future state question, how will workload and or activities be leveled? Leveling, or use the Toyota term Ijunka, another key concept of lean. And then very importantly, how will we manage the new process? So the earlier questions are talking about the work process itself, and we can change that, but if we don't change the management process, the changes we make in the work process will probably be short-lived. So we have to change the way we manage. And then the last question is, what process improvements will be necessary? Now, in practice, you're identifying those as you have discussions around the first 6 questions. You know, so we're not looking at this last question as a catch-all. But there might be some key things that we overlooked, and we want to get those. So let's go into each of these in a little more detail. You know, what does the customer really need? I'll introduce the term service level. More and more people are using this term. So we will design for a specific lead time, turnaround, response time, whatever term you want to use. And it's not just about time, it's got to be about quality. So we will be very clear on defining what is acceptable quality for this service or this output of this process. And if you think about it, you know, earlier in the webinar I mentioned that, you know, there tends to be very low information and service quality. Well, why does that happen? Maybe as measured by first pass yield. It's not that people are intentionally doing this. What often happens is we have not adequately defined what is acceptable quality in any measurable, understandable way. So people are just kind of figuring out themselves what works. But we've never really clearly defined what is and is not acceptable quality. We do in manufacturing. We have, you know, engineering documents and specifications and tolerances. You know, where's the analogy, you know, in service and offices? Now, I can set a service level, and people will say, okay, we can do this. We can give you the quality you want, the time you want, but, and very often the but is, we can only do this when we're not that busy. So let's talk about demand and demand rate or rates. If demand varies, we need to understand that. So in this first question, we look at the volume. Now we're looking at the future state, so we're not looking at the past volume. We're looking at, you know, looking ahead, maybe a year, 2 years out or so. And, you know, what we're trying to do here is understand and start thinking in terms of demand versus capacity, which we do in manufacturing, but we don't seem to do real well in office and services, though some services are doing much better with this. Call centers are getting really good at this. Because we have to make sure, and this is part of lean thinking, that we have the right resources in the right place to meet demand, and even variable demand. So that's all that's flushed out in this first question. There's really multiple questions within each of these. The next question, which steps create value, which are waste? As I mentioned, you don't want to go on a waste war. We want to focus on the key wastes that are obstacles to meeting the targets and objectives that we established. You know, we're not looking for 100 things. We're looking for the key things that we've got to really focus on. This is important because organizations have limited resources to put towards improvement, and you know it just makes sense. You can't do 100 things and do them well. So a lot of times people are coming with their predisposed biases of what should be done for the future state, and we'll keep asking, how does that idea, you know, relate to what problem we see in the current state and help us meet the objective and goals that we established? And as they try to explain that, they realize they can't sometimes, and they realize, okay, that's not such a good idea for what we're trying to do. So then, repeat it. It's about quality, not quantity, and it's about focused improvement rather than drive-by. So we might just have, like this week, we had maybe 10, 12, and some of them were very interrelated. So probably really 8 to 10, improvement ideas for the future state to fundamentally change the flow of work in the insurance company I'm working at this week. Which leads to the next question: how do we flow work with few interruptions? Now, it shouldn't surprise you that we asked the waste question before the flow question, because we don't want to flow waste better. So that should make sense. And even here, we're going to address some of the waste. What we're trying to do, the way this graphic works, in the upper portion of this is one approach, and then there's another approach. So what we're trying to do, let's say the work goes through 3 different processes and there's 3 different people performing those. And every time you have a handoff, you have the potential for a queue to form. Could we combine those processes and have one person do all 3? Now, not tomorrow, but, with requisite training and maybe some other changes that have to be done, could we see ourselves doing that, which would take out the opportunity for these 2 queues to form? So that is an approach to flow, combining steps. Now, we don't want to create new problems. What would be a new problem? That this person that we're asking to do all 3 processes here, you have to be a superhuman to do it. We wouldn't want to do that either. And that's why sometimes in very complex work, we might have to kind of do the bottom approach, where on the lower right-hand side, we're talking out here a kind of a single team, single process concept, maybe even co-locating them, ideally. Oops, sorry about that. But it's not just bringing them together, that we also have to balance the work. Because even if I bring them together, if the work is not balanced between the 3 team members, I still can have queues form. So the bottom half I talk about as a single team, single process concept, maybe physically co-locating, but certainly balancing the workload so we don't have the opportunity for queues to form. So those are 2 approaches to flow in office and service and manufacturing, really. Another approach would be concurrent or parallel process, if it's possible. Maybe I can do process 3 in parallel to 1 and 2. Sometimes you can do that. And that's another example of flow because it results typically in less lead time. You could also do a combination of all 3 of these approaches. But what you do depends on the nature of the work. So we always kind of talk about, can we do this? If we can't do that, can we do another, approach? And that generates a lot of great discussion. This week, they actually took a lot of handoffs out at the insurance company. And this is, again, not something they can do tomorrow. They have to do some cross-training, some movement of responsibilities to different roles to allow all that to happen. But it's going to take a lot of the queues out that are in the current state, and also take a lot of the loop backs, where they have to pass things back. So that's a good thing. Now, where we can't flow, and sometimes we can't, typically in strong multitasking environments we can't, and we're going to have to do some sort of batching. So in office and service, particularly more in office than service, but we're like, well, what's the right size batch? Another way of really looking at it is how frequently do I need to do things? Because it's not like some set batch quantity like you might have in manufacturing. It's more of how frequently do you do things. So if you look at the graphic in the upper left here, this is, say, an accountant person, and they do 3 different activities, and they just have this routine where maybe A is accounts receivables, and I'll do those on Mondays and Tuesdays. Then Tuesday I'll switch over to maybe my general ledger activities, and C, maybe on Wednesdays I'll switch over to my payables activities, and then I'll start the cycle all over again. So here I'm doing things really every week. Why? Yeah, maybe because that's what I always did. It works for me. But we would challenge that and say, is it better to do each of these transactions, each of these activities every day? Still doing batching, but smaller batches, more frequent in doing these. And very often the answer is, well, yeah, there would be some benefit to that. Well, if every day is better than every week, maybe every hour is better than every day. So, you have this conversation, how frequently do we need to do things in order to meet the service levels that were defined for the team and the exercise. Sometimes we don't have a choice but to do things every hour because we want to, we have a very aggressive service level that we have to get all orders entered within 1 hour or something. So we have to do everything every hour. So the key here is to see why people are batching. Sometimes they have good reasons. Sometimes it's just what they do, and there's no other reason for it. But we want to understand what those are in a current state, and if necessary, if we need to do things more frequent, we want to make sure we address those reasons. Whatever we do agree on, we need to be disciplined to it. Otherwise, if we agree, yeah, every day is okay, and someone decides, screw that, I'm going to go back to doing something every week, we probably are not going to meet our service level. So whatever we agree on, we've got to be disciplined to it. Now, what this means is things will queue up. That leads to the next future state question: how will interruptions in the flow be controlled? And in this graphic, let's say we can flow processes A, B, and C, and we can flow D and F, but there's no way we can link those together for whatever reason. So a queue can form. Now what we want to make sure is that queue doesn't grow uncontrollably. We've got to manage that queue so that the work is flowing through and we're meeting our overall goals and service levels that we established. Well, this gets into the concept of pull. Now, people struggle with applying pull to office and services, and I just want you to think of it as a decision tool. It helps us to decide what to make and when to make it in manufacturing, what to buy and when to buy it in, say, a purchased item. In the office, it tells us, what task should I do and what shouldn't I do in a multitasking environment. So all elements of pull systems have these, or all pull systems, I should say, have these 4 elements. One is visibility to the queue of work. We need to see where work is piling up. Then we have to put limits on it. How much is too much? How much is not enough? And then what decisions, the rules, what decisions do you want to make to keep things flowing when those limits are met? Now it could be, I put a max limit on this queue that tells A, B, and C folks that are doing A, B, and C that they're getting too far ahead of D and F folks. They're different folks. And it could be that maybe if we set it up this way, the A, B, and C folks go and help the D and F. Or maybe we can't do that. The A, B, and C folks go off and do something else, because it doesn't make sense to keep piling work up here. I can't go anywhere. And then if they're off somewhere else, I'm going to make sure they come back to keep the flow going. So we might have min rules on this. But that's basically a pull system. We're pulling people, resources. We're pulling, to promote the flow of the service or flow of the information. And ideally, that should be worker managed. The people closest to the work should be able to make those decisions. Now, in the beginning, we typically are teaching the supervisor or manager in the office or service to understand that. But in time, maybe we transfer that over to the hourly, the value-added people, basically. So we look to apply pull concepts within this. Now, when things queue up, this is an opportunity for people to pick and choose what they want to work on. And this is kind of interesting. In the current state maps, we will ask people, how do you prioritize work? And you'll go through the chain of processes, and you'll get different answers. Some people will be like, I do it, first in, first out. Some might say, I do bigger orders first. And you'll get these different answers. Well, you know what? The fact that people are prioritizing work differently, maybe that's an impediment to flow. And that's something we need to address in the future state. So we'll get agreement here. How should we prioritize the work? Is it first in, first out? In project environments, maybe it's by due date. Don't do first in, first out if you don't need something for 6 months. So this would be part of that design and that question of when interruptions occur, how are we going to control the flow? Now, the next question is how will workload interactivities be leveled? And we got into this week at this insurance company. It was a month-end phenomenon, actually. They do twice as much work the last week of the month than they do the other 3 weeks. So we started talking about that. We didn't really we understand the problem. We really don't understand the causes. That's something they're going to go look at. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something we can do about that, where we can level the volume on the system. Leveling is a deep concept, and people are, I think, just starting to nip around the edges with this. It also could be the mix of the work, the different types of work within the service family. We had that this week. There was easier work, and then there was more complex work that required different knowledge and skill levels of different resources. And it was like, running through the easy through the difficult maybe is not helping us. So they kind of have two different paths. Not even two different paths. Just different kind of roles and responsibilities to minimize that handoff. And so there's going to be a role that handles the easy, the pre-work and the easy, and then that same role will handle the pre-work, but if it's very complex, it's going to move on to another role. So it's leveling the mix, and that should actually help in terms of the easy should be able to flow very quickly, and the fact that we kind of have a fast track for those, the complicated work won't slow that down. And then we'll have visibility on the queues to see, is the mix, maybe we're getting a high level of volume of really complex stuff, and we're getting behind, the queue's growing. Well, we'll use the pull concepts for that. The mix can take a lot of different forms. It could be rushes, versus standard. The key here is that we can design a robust system based on the variation that we know occurs in the value stream within that service family. And we can design a robust system to kind of deal with that in as best way as possible. Now, all of those questions result in changing the workflow. Now we have to change the way we manage the process. And very quickly, what this means is how are we going to look at the process, how often are we going to look at the process, what metrics are we going to set up, not just process metrics and output metrics. How do we get visibility to performance and maybe even near real time so we can act and react. And very, very importantly is when we're not meeting standard conditions or not meeting standard work or not meeting the goals for the metrics that we establish, how do we engage the team members with management in improving the process? And we try to do all of this through visual management means. But we learned a long time ago that if you don't change the management process, then you only change the work process, the existing management process will be a strong anchor to sticking with the status quo. So we added a lot of content on this with the second edition of the book. So through those future state questions, we will have been identifying the key process improvements that are necessary to implement the future state. So, and we're not trying to get 100 things here, just key ones that we identified through the first 6 questions, a discussion around those first 6 questions. Now you got to achieve the future state, right? Mapping doesn't do anything if you don't make the future state a reality. And a couple things to keep in mind. We're using this expression a lot, learning your way to the future state. In other words, the future state is not cast in stone. It's a hypothesis. We think it will work, but we really don't know until the experiments begin and we do the PDCA cycles, the plan, do, check, act cycles, and see what works, what doesn't work, adjust where needed. And we tell people, it's a hypothesis. You're going to experiment. You're going to try some things. And based on what you learn, you may have to change the future state, tweak it, and you may have to change your implementation plan, and that's okay. Don't think that's a failure in any sense of the word. Some words of advice, too, because it can still be overwhelming. We might identify 8, 10 really big things that we have to work on, so where to begin? And we have some general guidelines here. These 2 are not cast in stone, but generally speaking, where can we get the proverbial low-hanging fruit? And what that means is things that don't require new IT efforts. There's a tendency for people that in the future state design that IT will solve all our problems, and they're already very busy people, and with a lot of them their play already. It's like, let's step back. What can we do to help ourselves that don't require new IT effort? And very often that's information quality issues, because that waste is, great in the current state, and we'll never be able to flow with information or service quality issues. So let's what can we do there? Training, education, checklists, things that we can do ourselves without a lot of IT support. Establish standard work. This week it was very difficult to map the current state because I must have heard the expression it's personal preference about 10 times. Well, what's the right way to do it? Not just personal preference, but what's going to be the best way to do it, and we should standardize on that. We can implement flow, very basically, just reshifting work or responsibilities, reducing handoffs, that kind of stuff. You usually don't need IT support to do that. Now, maybe there's some things that our IT friends can help us with, quickly. So that's, simplify where you can that require minimal IT effort. And there could be the big things that we've got to do with IT. I'm not saying, completely ignore that. But we've got to give people, relief in the short run. And so, if, we're going to do some new big IT solution. It's going to take 12 months or so to implement. I'm going to challenge that and say, okay, do that in parallel. What are we going to do in the next 3 months to help people, 3 to 6 months? We may or may not take the future state and chunk it or create loops to try to just get people's heads and hands around it, the future state. Like this week, we did not do that. But it seems to help people sometimes, chunking or come to segments of the future state, and then you would prioritize what segment do we want to work on first and which Kaizens within that, and just trying to really level the implementation plan and effort. So to wrap up, I'm going a little bit over, I think. It's a great tool. Yeah, I've got 2 books on this subject, so I'm very passionate about it. If it's done properly, it is an enabling tool to apply lean thinking, particularly if you use those future state questions. It's a great collaboration tool, and it should be a tool, a methodology used to get breakthrough results. So with that, turn it back over to Jerry. If you have other questions, please ask, and I'm very easy to get if you want to continue the discussion after the webinar.
Okay, great. Thanks, Drew. And we are short on time, but we'll try and reach some of these questions and we'll go a little bit over if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. So again, thanks, Drew. And now we will review any questions. So if you do have any questions, submit them on the right side of the screen. And any questions that we don't end up getting to, I will email to Drew and we'll provide you a response, hopefully by early next week. So the first question is, do you utilize detailed process mapping when you are trying to create work standards in a particular part of the value stream?
Great question, and yes. Why not? Value stream mapping is kind of a higher level. Classic process mapping is great for working those details out. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, great. The next question, in hiring example, help me understand the application of the product family concept. Grant that hiring for the C-suite will be different than hiring for the line manager. Still, there will be some common elements in common. How do you think through the process of deciding if this is one value stream or multiple value streams?
So do the processing steps really change? So I'll use an example at a university that I was working with. There was differences between hiring for an existing position versus hiring for a new position. There's all kinds of approval steps that had to be done for a new position. And, we have that conversation. Is this 2 maps or is it 1? And if there's enough difference, you're probably going to, map them separately. Because maybe even later in the process where they have common steps, there could be a lot of variation. If it's a new position, my onboarding process might be very different. My initial training, which we include in the hiring map, up to maybe first 3 months on the job, might be very different when it's a very new position versus an existing position. And the answer could be it's common enough that we can map one, and it fits both service families within that.
Okay, great, thanks. Another one is, I read in one article, when mapping a value stream, follow a product or service path from end to beginning. Why map backwards?
Yeah, I leave that up to people. I say try it that way, try it the other way, see what works for you, mix it up. The idea is that if you map from end to beginning, you'll have a stronger customer focus on that perspective. But I think you can get it either way, because you're going to move on. If you're going from beginning to end, you're going to ask people, what are you receiving? What's the quality of that? What issues do you have? I think, I wouldn't say that's the only way to do it. I would suggest try it both ways, mix it up sometimes. I tend to go from beginning to end, and once in a while I'll say, I think I'll try end to beginning and see. In general, it takes a little longer to do the map from end to beginning. because it's like reading a book. If you're starting to read the book from the back to the front. But I can understand the theory. People are going to ask more questions, that kind of stuff. So for simpler maps, or simpler value streams, I'm probably more likely to do end to beginning. For complex ones, I usually do from beginning to end. But I don't have a strong preference either way.
Okay, great. We have a couple more. We have always looked at teams of 5 to 8 for value stream mapping, with cross-functional members from outside of the areas being reviewed too. Any thoughts on team size and selection?
I would say that's a great number. You go much more than that. It's hard to get people in a cubicle. If you look at the picture on the front slide of this presentation, it's hard to get how many people can get in a cubicle to really observe the work. So 5 to 8 is good for the mapping team itself. Now, others will be involved, because we're going to go see. Maybe people aren't on the mapping team, but they're actually doing the work. So there's involvement there. We involve people maybe at the very beginning in the training portion. So we go to their cubicle or their office, and they already know what we're trying to do and why, and what data we're looking for. So involvement can take, different forms, but I would stick to the 5 to 8. In terms of the team makeup, you need to have people that kind of know the work enough, and maybe customers and suppliers to the process that represent the interfaces there. And that usually is 5 to 8, maybe an outside set of eyes as well. They're always good at asking a lot of questions and things. And next thing you know, you got 6 to 8 people, and that's a good number. If you try to load it up, which some organizations do on me, it just becomes unwieldy. When people start walking away because they just can't all be attentive. And that's true, and even if you try to do this in a conference room. That's a great question.
Okay, great. We have 2 more. One is, how do you perform go-see process in service environments?
You go see. I mean, I've done this for hospitality. We're with the housekeeping folks, tending to the rooms and things. In the office environments, you go see where the work is. You're in the cubicles. You're seeing the work environment. You see the interruptions that they're dealing with. Sometimes we can't go see because the work is, maybe constitutes hours and hours, and is maybe done off-site, or it's done over months-long periods. So then you got to get a little creative. So, if it's done off-site, we might bring that person in, or nowadays we can do Skype, that kind of thing. But they're actually doing the work maybe in another state or country, and we all can see them. They're on their computer systems. We can see the computer system. They're showing us the forms that they're using, whatever tools they're using. So with the technology today, with Skype and things like that, we've been able to handle that, where the location, where activities are being performed, effectively. If it, work is hours and hours, you can't go see and observe it. So we just have people walk us through what they do. Usually we would prepare examples of recent projects and things. This is more in project-oriented work. That would have been part of the prep. They would pull out those examples of folders, of files, forms, and show people this is kind of what I was doing with this. And you want to show and tell as much as possible, not just tell. So you got to be a little creative at how to make the work visible, especially when it's hours and hours of work, or the work is done over months and months. I've mapped everything where the process is 5 hours long and 15 years long. So you got to be a little nimble and creative on how you make that work visible.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I know we're over, so I apologize, but we'll get it in. Do you think that process mapping or swim lanes are better than visual stream mapping for admin processes? Why? Why not?
So, I always ask people, this is a very common question, why do you want to do a swim lane? What do you expect to learn from it? And usually what people tell me is, we want to know who does what, what department or function. And that could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. So I was like, well, you could put a note on a value stream map without having these lanes, if everyone understands what a swim lane is, which are typically by department or function, these rows on the map. I could put notes in a process box of who does what. We did that this week. We had the people icon, and we put a note. That's an underwriter, that's a claim person, adjuster. We had those notes. But sometimes that's not so good because when we get to the future state, they're kind of married to who's doing what, and they're not thinking creatively. But maybe we can shift some activities or sub-activities or roles and responsibilities. We're missing some important opportunities that did not happen this week. Then they'll say, well, not just who does it, but I want to really show the handoffs. Well, the reality is every handoff to a different role is going to be a different process box because there's the potential for a queue in between, so you're going to see that. So, I tell people it's a flexible tool, use it flexibly, but don't make the map unnecessarily more complex than it needs to be. And I've seen people try to do value stream mapping with a pool of swim lanes that are 11 deep. And it's so complex you can't understand when things are happening. And it's just like, how about we just put some notes of who does what? And I've seen people color code by function or department. And next thing you know, that 11-lane pool, it collapses to one or two. And we can really clearly see what's being done and when and what's happening in parallel. Because that's really important to understand, is what is happening in parallel. So, it's your preference, but my suggestion is always don't overcomplicate these things if you don't have to.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. It actually went a little bit over. And any questions we did not review, I'll send them to Drew and send you an email back response. And thank you again for your participation and understanding. And thank you, Drew, for a very insightful presentation. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next scheduled webinar will be on Thursday, June 2nd, titled When Lean Doesn't Stick and What to Do About It, with Rebecca Morgan. Please visit AME.org under the AME Events and Training tab for more information and to register. Please don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a productive